we're going to start a short discussion on sideboard cards that currently and previously have seen play in Burn. Like some matchups, or why some of them have fallen out of favor, why some of them were used to begin with, etc. So kind of had a bit of an extensive list here between chat and myself here on Twitch. So we can start. I'm going to start with the companions. Now, obviously, Lurrus was like the biggest one. This is the one that when companions were unnerfed, this is the one that saw the most play in Burn, was kind of the most free roll. It's probably still the card that sees the most play. As a free roll in the sideboard, even with the nerfed companion rule. Obviously, it fits right in with Burn strategy. Burn is a deck, obviously, that's trying to play 2 CMC and less permanents, so it works with Lurrus and still sees play. So it's kind of a preference, like, do you want to give away information, or do you want to in a sideboard slot, or do you want to have a little bit of extra grinding power? Not the most relevant, but still kind of a fine card in the Burn sideboard overall. Obosh, I don't know that I ever truly saw play in like Boros or Gruul or any of that, but it is certainly a card that has seen play in some of the like mono red burn decks that are basically packing mostly 1s and 3s. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And then Gigantha, it was a kind of a free roll one that you could run. It didn't see much play, but I did occasionally see lists, especially with the mono red variety, that would run Gigantha, and it's certainly been a sideboard card that's seen play in other formats. Even while we're sitting here doing things, I thought of other cards that have seen play in Burn decks. Smash to Smithereens, we already had. Alright, and then the next set is another set of cards that you don't see much of. Leyline of Sanctity has seen play in some really... Oh, I definitely agree it's more prowess, War Dog, but it's still something that has seen play in red-based decks, especially the mono-red burn variants. And some of those early Hayashi burn decks, or Hayashi prowess decks, were very border between burn and prowess. Sanctity hasn't seen much play in Burn. I have seen it pop up in occasional lists as tech for like mirror matches, and it used to stop some random nonsense. Like it was a decent sideboard card against Mill when we were worried about that. It's a decent sideboard against some of the older Ad Nauseam builds that were more dependent upon just Lightning Storm rather than the I think their kills were Lightning Storm and the 2-1 or the 2 and a blue Laboratory Maniac. So this was a way to like shut off their primary win con. Leyline of Punishment was also decent against Valakut, especially under the old Valakut rules. And then Leyline of Punishment was a card that people would turn to when life gain just gets ridiculous. Especially before the printing of Roiling Vortex. And then Leyline of Combustion is a card that I'll still break out on occasion. Mainly you bring this card out when you're facing like a bunch of Jund decks, a bunch of basically the decks in a format that's trying to like interact with you on a targeting basis. It's also pretty decent in the mirror match, turning every one of your opponent's like bolt effects into they take 2 damage is pretty nice. And then other cards that like see play at points. Ensnaring Bridge has seen play at some points as kind of an answer to usually humans and such, until humans kind of adapted and became null and void. And a lot of people were talking about bringing it back against like Death and Taxes and humans and such. It's just like it's a card that if it catches them by surprise is quite good, but otherwise is like mediocre as a 3 cost. Anything 3 cost or more in Burn has to really have a high impact to be worth it. And then other cards that pop up on occasion. Blood Moon is a card that's popped up a couple times in some recent lists, including a list that I played tonight. It's something most people don't expect out of Burn, especially non-mono red varieties. Mono red Burn, obviously, Blood Moon's kind of a free roll. And then Klothys, I don't want to speak 100% on this, but I do believe the driving force behind Klothys being a Burn sideboard card was Poseidon out of the Burn Discord. This is a card that primarily sees play against like very grindy metas, simply because, especially before a lot of those decks were adopting large numbers of Ethergusts, Klothys is a very hard card to deal with once it hits the board. It cannot generally be path. It cannot generally be, dismembered or, yes, Foz, red-green. I gotcha. You've certainly been on a red-green burn kick lately, Foz. But, it's a card that is difficult to interact with. Chews away at the opponent's graveyard, albeit slowly. And I found it in some of the more attrition-based, like Burn and Prowess mirrors, like the old, when you were playing against Izzet, or you were playing against the old Luris builds, or even Mono Red. Like, just a Klothys chewing away at their graveyard and gaining life. And even in like some of the Burn mirrors that became the more attrition ones, where there's a bunch of trading off of burn spells on creatures, and it's a low resource game. Klothys takes over in those games if you can get to the third mana. But it kind of fell out of favor, especially once Rolling Vortex was printed, largely because Vortex does a lot. Not the same things as Klothys, but help to manage like the Uro matchups, which was one of the primary reasons for Klothys to come out and play. Wear Tear, this is kind of the go-to multi-purpose shatter disenchant effect in the Boros versions, because the Boros versions, especially if you don't want to splash green for either D-Rev or Cindervines, it's just a card that is more flexible with the loss of obviously the damage from Smash to Smithereens. Dismember, this one's almost exclusively played in just the mono red variants of Burn that have popped over the years. This gives you answers to bigger creatures like Tarmogoyfs and Thought-Knot Seers and such. So, it's a nice card that's kind of a pseudo path to exile, except obviously it's costing you life. But if you're in the mono red variants, you generally aren't running a ton of pain lands. You might run some number of the canopy lands. So it was kind of a card that seen play. It's kind of fallen out of favor, especially since a lot of the red-based burn decks are very close to Prowess-esque builds, if they're not Prowess builds themselves, and run Soulscar Mage. So Dismember has kind of fallen out of favor in those matchups. Exquisite Firecraft. Now this is a card that I used to be one of my go-to cards against any type of blue control deck. It was a card that you could like guarantee would resolve and just like destroy you're a lot of times with control decks, especially specifically counterspell based blue control decks, you're trying to prevent only the last spell from resolving that would kill you. Exquisite Firecraft would sit there and go, oh, as long as I have 2 or more instants in my graveyard or sorceries, you can't counter my last spell, so you're kind of in trouble. And then Ethergust was kind of the reason this card went away for the most part, and the fact that most of the decks that are playing it are Uro decks anyway, means that the 4 damage could be a little bit slow sometimes to happen, so you often had to turn to other cards to deal with it. Speaking of Uro, I guess I should go, and I'm just going to kind of go off on a bit of a tangent here and talk about these 4 cards. So, Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus, Surgical Extraction, Tormod's Crypt. I guess some variants also played, what is the name of the card? Oh, Soul Guide Lantern. This was more a thing when Luris was unnerfed. These 5 cards all do the same thing but do it very differently. Rest in Peace is kind of the go-to. Alright, Foz, I'll get to Veil of Summer in a second. I almost feel like you're trolling me now, Foz. But these cards do a little bit different things in what they're trying to do. Relic is more of a value-based card. It helps keep the graveyard under control and has the ability to exile everything. Rest in Peace is obviously the hard graveyard hate piece. Comes in, exiles the graveyard, and anything gets exiled after it leaves. It's more of a permanent-based hate. Soul Guide Lantern is kind of like the happy medium between Tormod's Crypt and Relic. Like, you can come in, exile a card right away, which is important, and then either sacrifice it to exile each opponent's graveyard, or you can pay 1 to draw a card with it, sack it to draw a card. But it's a lot weaker than both Crypt and Relic. It's just that it's a little bit more flexible, especially when you're running Luris, when you don't necessarily want to get rid of your own graveyard. And Surgical Extraction, so the two main targets of Surgical Extraction that have existed over time have primarily been, well, actually 3, were in the Arclight Phoenix days. You would see this card sometimes as a counter to specifically the card Arclight Phoenix, although burn decks didn't usually have to resort to that because they usually had a pretty good matchup against Arclight Phoenix. And in more recent times, once again, I want to say Poseidon's the one that brought it up, but I'm sure there are other people that have tried Surgical in burn sideboard at points. But Poseidon brought it up as a counter to both Uro and Creeping Chill, 2 cards that Burn tremendously cares about. So that kind of breaks down the graveyard portion of things. Another oddball card that we'll get into here is Angel's Grace. Angel's Grace is specifically good in 2 matchups. It's specifically good against, I guess it would be 3 now. It's good against, originally it was mainly for Ad Nauseam in the mirror match. Ad Nauseam is a weird deck in the way it works, but most of the time they empty their entire library and then win with, nowadays, it's either Thassa's Oracle, Lightning Storm. Those are the primary ways it wins the game. So if you have some way to just like randomly survive that turn that they can't counter, especially with Split Second, they can't Pact of Negation or anything. You can like Grace for a turn, and then their next turn, unless they have a Grace themselves, they're dead. And then finally, nowadays, it could be used as tech against Oops All Spells, although Oops usually has some way to get themselves another turn, be it Nexus of Fate or any of the Eldrazi, or sometimes they're running Journey to Memory, or Memory to something or other. Memory's Journey, it's like a 1 and a green flashback, put 3 cards on the top of your library. That pretty much covers that little weird one. The next one would be, I guess, the remaining removal spells. You have Path to Exile, Flame Slash, Searing Blood, and Searing Blaze. So Path to Exile, pretty much the go-to removal spell out of most burn variants out of the sideboard. It specifically gives you answers to both big creatures and creatures with protection from red. So your Oriok Champions, your Burrington Forge Tenders, your Core Firewalkers in the mirror match, etc. This gives you an out to those particular cards. Flame Slash is kind of the pseudo Path to Exile out of the mono red decks. It allows you to go a little bit bigger in the creatures you're killing than your typical 3 damage spell. Searing Blaze and Searing Blood are kind of the go-to cards against smaller creature decks. That reminds me of another card that used to be in the sideboard. It's Grimlav Answer. These are the cards that never end. Basically, Searing Blood deals 2 damage to a creature, and if it dies, deals 3 damage to the controller. Blaze does 1 and 1 if you've had landfall that turn. Deals 3 and 3. Blood only requires you to be able to target the creature which is nice. Blaze requires you to both be able to target the controller and the creature, so it does get shut down by something like Leyline of Sanctity. But still a very powerful card overall for what it does. Grimlav Answer. This card's kind of fallen out of favor just because it's kind of slow. But this was one of the go-to answers for when a bunch of creature decks have ruled the format. You know, when decks, and still pops up on occasion when decks like Devoted Devastation, Humans. It could be okay against Death and Taxes, Merfolk. Basically, any deck that relies on a huge amount of small creatures, Grimlav Answer is a very good thing against. And that pretty much covers creature removal of everything I can think of. The next thing is Artifact and Enchantment Hate. You had Stony Silence, you have Smash to Smithereens, you have Destructive Revelry, you have Cindervines, you have Shattering Spree. When metas get really skewed, sometimes you'll see Shatterstorm. Basically, they all do a little bit different things. Shattering Spree is a card that I think the last time I saw it was out of the Obosh Prowess decks, simply because it's a 1-mana replicate that can get around Chalice. Mainly this is here to answer Chalice and any type of problematic artifacts. Back before Mox Opal was banned and Affinity got nerfed, you'd see Affinity, you'd see Lantern Control, you would see more Urza decks than we do now. You know, just the ability to target multiple artifacts was kind of the big draw to this one. Cindervines was a useful one, especially when it first came out. Being able to kind of pair up with Eidolon to really like give control decks and storm decks extra fits. In addition to the fact that it was a card that could target artifacts and enchantments. The problem with Cindervines is like a threefold problem. The first one is there aren't as many enchantments that you need to answer in D-Rev. First off, D-Rev's more mana efficient to specifically kill enchantments. And Storm and Is It Phoenix, two of the decks that Cindervines was particularly good against, as well as Blue-White Control, all have kind of faded from the meta. Like, Blue-White still exists, but Blue-White has access to Teferi Time Raveler in addition to Cryptic Command, so Cindervines isn't as effective as it once was. Plus, also the card Ethergust makes it a lot less effective, and it's slower than almost any of the other options you have at dealing with problematic permanents. You could also throw Wear Tear into this list, obviously. Smash to Smithereens is kind of the default choice for most burn decks at this point. It's 3 damage and destroys the artifact. Not much more to say about that. Destructive Revelry, if you're in green, this is just superior to almost all of these choices, simply because it has the flexibility to destroy both and does 2 damage. So it still does damage without giving up the flexibility, though not as much damage as Smash to Smithereens. And the final one was Stony Silence. Stony Silence was more important when decks like Affinity was a thing, Hardened Scales was more of a thing, decks like Crackling Ironworks combo was a thing. This was a card that you would see more often when Mox Opal was part of the format, simply as a way to just like shut all their artifacts off. You know, there were a lot of matchups like Affinity and such where you didn't matter how many removal spells you have, you couldn't answer all of their threats in an efficient enough time. Plus, they had a creature called Master of... Was it Master of Ethereum? No, Master of Ethereum was the Lord. There was a 3-mana 2/2 that had Metalcraft protection from all colors. And then if they ever got a cranial plating on that, you were pretty much dead. I can see the card, but I can't see what it's called. It's one of the things I sometimes recognize the art more than I do the names of the cards, especially cards that I haven't seen in some time. Oh well. Moving on. But mainly the purpose of Stony Silence was just to shut down artifacts that you couldn't stop. as champion. Thanks, Schultz. That's much appreciated. But yeah, as the Mox Opal decks got banned, Stony Silence just kind of ceased to be a relevant card. Although it is something to keep in mind when you're playing against decks with a bunch of equipment and Ether Vials. One of Stony Silence could go a long way towards driving those decks to extinction. Core Firewalker. This is Mirror Match and Prowess Tech. Sometimes you'll bring it in against decks that you're expecting to bring in Leyline of Sanctity. Beyond that, not much to say. It's like a 10 in those matchups, but almost every other matchup you don't bring it in. Unless all of your opponent's removal is red for some reason. Dragon's Claw. This is kind of the tech that sometimes... It is not War Dog. War Dog asked the question, if those of you who can't read the text later, does destroying enchantments really come up a lot? It usually doesn't, unless you're already, unless you're running, the weird configuration I was with, Incinerator Burn, and you're just running green anyway. It really doesn't come up all that much. You're usually better off with either Smash to Smithereens or Wear Tear if you really want the flexibility without the extra damage. And these days, I'm not even sure it's about the damage as much as it is the land bases being under attack again. Especially with that Jeskai Wildfire deck that Aspiring Spike brought to the forefront. The Death and Taxes decks. It certainly does, Foz, but you're still not cold to Leyline. If you anticipate Leyline, you can still bring in your core Firewalkers or any creatures you may have out of sideboard, just to not be cold to it. Alright, so Dragon's Claw, back to that discussion real quick. Dragon's Claw, this is kind of it's a card that you'll see out of mono red burn for the mirror matches, and it's also a card you'll see out of, people that are getting really cheeky in the mirror matches, because the standard tech is to bring in core Firewalkers and bring in Path to Exiles, but if you're bringing in a Dragon's Claw, most people aren't prepared to bring in, artifact hate against the mirror match. That reminds me, another card. What is the name of that card? 2-mana artifacts. Shrine of Burning Rage. That's another card that has seen play in some numbers. Shrine of... There we go. Alright. So Alpine Moon, Cleansing Wildfire, Blood Moon. These cards are all kind of part of the same part and parcel. Mainly they're here to attack big mana decks, Tron, E-Tron, potentially Valakut decks, Field of the Dead if you really wanted to go that deep with Cleansing Wildfire. Alpine Moon's the most mana efficient. Cleansing Wildfire cantrips. Blood Moon, if you're playing a mono red variant of Burn or a variant that can board out all of its white or green cards, can sometimes catch people off guard, especially if they've seen white and green mana out of you in game 1. They're not going to be expecting Blood Moon out of Burn. So these are cards that are kind of good for managing Tron and E-Tron especially. Valakut to a certain degree. Also can be okay against the Amulet, especially Blood Moon. But not a whole lot to say more about that. These aren't cards you're going to see frequently pop up in Burn. A 1-of Alpine Moon, sometimes you'll see something like that. Rolling Vortex and Skullcrack. These were kind of another card you'll see is sometimes is Flames of the Blood Hand. Is a card sometimes you'll see. They all serve the same point, and that's to stop life gain. Skullcrack's the one that you'll see in the main decks most of the time. Atarka's Command. like, it's kind of crazy, like, as you go through alright, let's try that. It's a lot of command cards. But these are all the typical cards you'll see against anti-life gain. Roiling Vortex, the new permanent-based one. Yeah, I was just talking in general, War Dog. Like, when you have a specific meta, like, sometimes you're going to play cards that just would not see play in a more open event. You know, like, we have... Like, legitimately, there's been points where I've had to pack Arcane Spotlight? Spotlight Tower, whatever the card is. There's a card that allows you to pay 1 and tap it, that all of your opponents lose hexproof until end of turn. Because we have a guy in our local shop that likes to play Boggles, and then there was a couple other people also playing Boggles. So if I wanted to play Burn, I had to run this stupid land just to be able to target their stuff. So, I mean, there are times, like, in local metas, you're going to see just weird, off-the-wall cards sometimes. Just to stop Tron. Yeah. Can understand that. Shrine of Burning Rage. This is a card that some people use to sidestep or in more attrition matchups. Very similar to things like Clothis. It's just a card that threatens a lot of damage as the game goes along. Not much more else to say about it. Deflecting Palm. This is kind of a crowd favorite. There was a time where I was like one of the biggest proponents of this card, and then there have been times where I thought this card was absolutely useless. More recently, with the resurgence of Death Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclave, and it being okay against Tron with like Wormcoil and stuff, it's a fine card. It's a 1 of or 2 of in the sideboard in big creature heavy metas. It's decent, but there's a lot of ways for decks to play around that, and even sometimes them playing around it, like with seeing it with Inquisition, fun against Infect, indeed. But definitely an interesting card. Damping Sphere, fine card against Tron decks. Fine cards against Storm decks. Was a fine card against Crackland Ironworks. Was one of the main times this card would see play. Ironically, I don't think the two existed all that long together. Celestial Purge, not a lot of play. I've seen it on occasion in burn sideboards, mainly to deal with like Liliana the Veil. Also deals with Death Shadows in addition to like Path Exiles. So doesn't see a ton of play, but okay in some spots. And finally, fan requested by Foz, Veil of Summer. If you absolutely have to stop discard spells, or absolutely have to make some of your burn spells uncounterable, just cast a Veil of Summer. Certainly drives the Jund players nuts. But I do think that about covers like all of the different cards that I've seen in sideboards and whatnot. I'm sure there are cards that indeed it does cantrip, Foz. Indeed it does cantrip. Cannot forget that value. But Veil is evil. It's even more appreciated when I played that Dimir burn deck and got blown out by Veil of Summer. So I finally felt the Jund players playing as a burn player losing to that card. But if you're on the YouTube's channel and you happen to have sat through this rambling discourse of the different sideboard cards, and you can think of any other card that I have forgotten about or our collective consciousness hasn't thought about, please leave it down in the comments below. I'd greatly appreciate trips down memory lane. You know, because there was actually probably 2 or 3 years of Modern that I didn't actually play Burn. Maybe even 4 years. So there might be some like cards from like Burn's early history that I don't even remember. You know. And I'm sure... I could be really cheeky and be like, well, Oko or Ethergust out of the goofy Is-It versions I've played, but I don't think that really... those cards really particularly count. So, anywho, I greatly appreciate y'all hanging out tonight. I'll be back tomorrow night with some other stuff as far as what